Hi everyone, Troy Martin, TM Fitness. Let's talk about carbohydrates. Yes, carbohydrates, yum. So, carbohydrates contain 4 kilocalories per gram of carbohydrate. Okay, same as protein, half as much as there are in fats. Carbohydrates are important for muscle contraction, especially important for intense exercise. So, carbohydrates, unlike the other two macronutrients, are not entirely necessary for life and survival, but they're very, very important for activity. When you consume carbohydrates, they're immediately broken down and turned into glycogen, which is stored in the liver and in the muscles, and then that gets broken down into glucose, which is your blood sugars. You need glycogen in your body to be able to perform movements, and particularly intense movements, exercises. So whether you're running or lifting weights, glycogen and obviously carbohydrates in the diet are very, very important. Carbs do not make you fat. Contrary to popular belief, carbohydrates are not the reason that we're all fat and obese and diabetic, because obviously we're not. The caveat to that is that obviously the more intense exercise you do, the more carbohydrates you need. The more sedentary you are, the less carbohydrates you need. So sometimes, we need to look at this again, rather than looking at, extreme ends of, high carb or no carb. There's lots of grey area in between. Try and find the balance that is right for you. Okay, so there's two kinds of carbohydrate: starch, which is found in tubers and whole grains and pulses and those kind of foods, and sugars, which is obviously found in fruit and syrup and honey and sugar granules, caster sugar, all that kind of stuff. The starch tends to be a slightly slower release than the sugars, whereas the sugars will be delivered straight to the bloodstream. The starches will be broken down more slowly. Whether it's a starch or a sugar, it will eventually all end up as sugar anyway, because it all gets turned into glycogen. Now, when we're talking about the sugars, obviously the simple sugars, they're a little bit demonized these days. People tend to lump fruits in as sugar when they're cutting down or cutting out sugar from the diet, but fruit is very important for you. It's very high in fiber and essential vitamins. Because of that higher fiber and vitamin content, the sugars in fruit break down more slowly and are stored slightly differently. Replacing sugar in cakes with honey, for example, as a lot of people do, is complete nonsense. The amount of micronutrition in honey is tiny. You're better off just eating a balanced, healthy diet with lots of vegetables, rather than worrying about whether your source of sugar has got, a milligram or microgram of something in it that might be good for you. Honey is just sugar. Okay, so you've got the glycemic index and the glycemic load. Glycemic index is a score given to foods, in particular carbohydrate foods, depending on how quickly they break down. So a high GI food, a food with a high GI score, the higher the score, the faster it breaks down. So caster sugar, for instance, has the highest GI, and then something like, say, a sweet potato has a moderate to low GI. That's only really useful for diabetics. It has no bearing on weight loss or weight management whatsoever. And you've got a glycemic load, which is a measure. It's a more accurate or more meaningful metric. It's a measure of the total carbs in that food or that meal. Whereas you might have something on your plate that is a high GI food, the total load of the glycemic load of everything that's on that plate is much lower. You've always got to look at the context of these things. High GI isn't always bad, and in some cases, a high GI food, like a sugar, like an energy gel, for an example, is very, very useful when you need instant energy. Like, if you're an endurance athlete, if you're on a 5-hour bike ride, at some point you're going to need to get some of that sugar into your bloodstream to keep your muscles fueling. So as I say, starch, sugar, it's all 4 kilocalories. So in the grand scheme of energy balance, it doesn't matter. Obviously the quality of the foods you're eating, if you're concerned about your health, absolutely does matter. Right, so how much carbohydrate should you be getting in your diet? Well, the ISSN, you know, these are very, very clever people. There's a bunch of scientists that have done a bunch of research, and they've looked at hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands, of research papers. They've discarded what isn't useful. They've kept what is useful, and they've adapted that to their recommendations, and their recommendations are sound. These people are way cleverer than me. They're way cleverer than you. So for a moderately active person, this is kind of like your recreationally active individuals, 3 to 5 grams of carbohydrate per kilogram of lean mass. For most people, like if you're the kind of person that goes to the gym and you do 45 minutes to an hour of machine work and a little bit of cardio, maybe 3 times a week, 3 to 5 grams is going to be more than enough. If you're super sedentary, less than 3 grams per kilogram is going to be more than enough. For people that are more highly active, people that have a much higher training load and a much higher intensity level to their training, 5 to 8 grams per kilogram of body weight. And for like elite athletes during really high demanding efforts, 10 to 12 grams per kilogram of body weight, which is a lot. When you look at the data that's collated from the Tour de France cyclists, for example, they're going to be in this sort of 8, 10 to 12 range for the most part. It's important to realise that the carbohydrates aren't just important for fuel during exercise, they're important for recovery after exercise as well. So if you're glycogen depleted, your muscles will not recover as effectively or as quickly as they will if they're full of glycogen. So it's necessary to replete those glycogen stores, but the caveat to that being, if you're not going to exercise again that day, you don't immediately have to carb load again after exercise. Assuming that, you know, like most people, you're going to be exercising at some point in the day, and then at some point after that, you're going to have a meal and maybe a snack. That's fine. You don't have to immediately fuel afterwards. If you're going to be training again that day, then immediately refuel. So when it comes to balance in the diet, roughly around 50% of total calories should be coming from carbohydrates, and around 25% from fats and 25% from protein. That's just as a rough guideline, but percentages aren't the most accurate, because obviously the higher your calorie needs, the higher the amount of carbohydrates, for example, will change. So 50% of 2,000 calories is 100% less than 50% of 4,000 calories. So just use this as a guideline. It doesn't have to be this exact number either. Some people are very, very glucose tolerant and have very good levels of insulin sensitivity, so they can have 50% or higher. Some people not so much, so they might want to go lower. Listen to your body. When you eat food that is high in carbohydrates, how does it make you feel? Do you feel a little bit sluggish and sleepy afterwards? Maybe you're eating the wrong type of carbohydrates, and maybe it's too much carbohydrate for you. Some people can thrive on a very low carbohydrate diet. I don't recommend it for the general population. I don't recommend it for athletes, but some people do well on that. So again, just listen to your body. Ideally, you will be basing your macronutrients based on grams rather than percentages, and I will cover that in the next video. Just for a moment, going back to the glycemic load and glycemic index and the whole thing about sugars and carbs making you fat, it's all about the calories in terms of body composition. The insulin hypothesis has been broadly discredited. It's nonsense. It's a theory that just doesn't work out in practice. If you are insulin resistant and you have insulin resistant related illnesses like type 2 diabetes or PCOS, then absolutely cutting down on carbohydrates, and particularly cutting down on the simpler carbs and the sugars, is going to be a good thing to do for a period of time until you increase your level of insulin sensitivity. If you're relatively lean and you're relatively active, and in particular if you're doing resistance training, your levels of insulin resistance will be low. You will be quite insulin sensitive, so it doesn't matter, you can eat carbs, you're not instantly going to store those on your belly or your thighs. Okay, so that's carbohydrates in a nutshell. As I say, if you want to find out how to work out your macros, wait around for the next video. So make sure you click subscribe. So there should be a little disc around here somewhere, maybe up here, a little round thing. Click that to subscribe to the channel. Click over here because there's a video here, or maybe it's this side, I'm not sure. Leave a comment below, and I'll speak to you again soon. Laters.